The schedule trigger for workflows lets you set up flexible, repeating schedules to automatically run workflows at your chosen time. To create a scheduled workflow, open the workflow editor and select Schedule as the trigger. By default, this will generate a new workflow that runs every day at 9 a.m. in your time zone. You can change how often the schedule will run, which days of the week to run it, the specific time, and the time zone. If you already know when you want the workflow to trigger, you can adjust these schedule settings now, or you can wait and adjust them later. A message will appear at the bottom of your configuration to confirm when the workflow will run next. Next, build out the workflow the same way you would with other types of triggers. Each of these pieces we add here is called a step. Steps can be actions in Glide, conditional branches, or loops, and you can even nest loops and conditions within each other. A loop is automatically created, but this can be deleted if you don't want to use a loop. Loops are basically sets of instructions that repeat through your data until all of the conditions have been met. If you need to add a loop or a conditional branch, you can do that by clicking the Add Step button and selecting what you need from the Flow submenu. Let's take a look at an example of a scheduled workflow we use here at Glide in our LMS. If you've done a Glide certification in the past, you know that when they are close to expiring, you get an email from the education team reminding you to renew your certification or pass a new one to keep your credentials up to date. Now, we power these emails with a scheduled workflow in Glide. Here's the first email that goes out. First, we create a schedule trigger to run our workflow every day at 11:55 p.m. New York time. Everything else that happens in this workflow is then part of just one loop. The data source for our loop is the certification passes table, because this is where we track current certifications. Loops need parameters to know when to stop running, so the first thing we had to do was create those parameters in our data. To do this, we created simple checkbox columns in our table. When an email in the series is sent, a step in our workflow checks the box. We also created an if-then-else column that checks if the certification is within 30 days of expiring. You'll see how we use these later on in the setup. So let's go back to the workflow to see how this works step by step. In the first step of our loop, we tell the instructions to filter by the send first email column. This is the starting point for this workflow, so we want the loop to check this column first. Here we've got the limit set to 1,000, but this is a bit arbitrary. The loop will continue until all parameters are met. Setting this limit to 1,000 means the loop will check through 1,000 rows before repeating. It could just as easily be 500 or 2,000 rows, and this is up to you. Now, let's look at the instruction steps within this loop. First, we have the condition in order for the rest of the steps to run, which checks if the certification is within 30 days of expiring. This is using that if-then-else column we made previously, and all it does is check the expiration date of the most recent certification for this user. If the date is within 30 days of today, then it's time to email the user. Because we run this workflow every day, our automation checks these dates every day and emails new users as needed. Okay, so once the loop confirms that the user needs an email, the next step is to send that email. So we have a send email action here that we've set up with our email template text. It sends to the individual user who needs that email. You'll notice here that this step has a little update flag. That's because every time this step runs successfully, it will use one update. Next, we need to adjust some values in our data because we actually change the user experience for learners when they're in the renewal window. Then we want our workflow to track that the email was actually sent, and we want to be notified that it worked. So another set column value step will check the box in our table called first email sent, and this will change the value to true. And finally, we want a Slack message confirming an email was sent to that user, so we've added a send message to channel action. And that is the whole workflow. It checks our table every evening for users who are expiring in 30 days, sends them an email, checks a box confirming the email was sent, and then notifies our team the whole process was successful. And we can test this workflow manually whenever we need by just hitting the run button at any time. If you create workflows like this, just make sure you do this with test data so you don't accidentally run the real workflow. When you're ready, you can enable the workflow and let it run automatically on the schedule you set. Now, if you ever want to adjust scheduled workflows, you can open it up in the workflow editor and make changes as needed. If the workflow runs into any errors, you'll get an email with more details and can troubleshoot with the workflow logs and the run history details. The schedule trigger is just one of the ways you can start a workflow in Glide. To learn about the other triggers, join us at glideapps.com/learn.